The most famous human being in all of history was a first-century Jewish revolutionary. His name was Jesus. Christians believe Jesus was crucified, died, and on the third day rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. But for 2,000 years, there have been those who've challenged the truth of this biblical story. And some have died for expressing those doubts. From Jerusalem to the villages of southern France, from the wildness of distant Kashmir to the exotic Philippines, we shall try to solve this 2,000-year-old mystery. We'll take a journey that asks, did Jesus really die on the cross? The story of Christianity features not only the most famous name in history, but also the most famous event in history, the crucifixion. For some, or even many true believers, the fact that Jesus was crucified, died, rose again, and ascended into heaven can be literal truth. But throughout history, there have always been those, sometimes Christians, who've asked awkward questions. Would a man die after only 6 hours on the cross? Was he drugged? What really happened in the sepulchre? And if Jesus didn't ascend into heaven, then where did he go? For many Christians, these questions risk undermining the whole basis of Christianity and are extremely controversial. The most crucial part of the story, which all Christians are expected to believe, is the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. The resurrection.
The resurrection is actually the primary story at the heart of Christianity, without which you wouldn't have a movement. You could have Christianity without the virgin birth. However, none of them tells it without a resurrection story.
Despite the best efforts of the Church, the resurrection of Jesus and his later ascension into heaven have, for 2,000 years, been fertile ground for heresy. Some people suggest that Jesus was rescued from the crucifixion and escaped to live a secret life in southern France. Some have been convinced that Jesus survived and travelled to the mountain kingdoms of Kashmir, where he lived to the age of 80. With the help of leading historians and theologians, we will examine these most controversial theories. There have been those who've gone back to the original gospel stories of Jesus' death and resurrection and come up with more credible, but no less startling conclusions about what exactly happened 2,000 years ago.
You read the story of the empty tomb, and on Friday someone is killed, and on Sunday they're gone from the tomb, and you ask the question, what might have happened? Either God raised him from the dead, which is the traditional Christian affirmation, or the body was carried away by someone, body stolen.
But there is another possibility. The Gospels describe how, after his resurrection, Jesus ate, drank, and Thomas could touch his wounds. It's therefore perhaps not surprising that some people, who've looked for natural explanations of miracles, have suggested that Jesus was alive because he didn't die on the cross.
There are many versions of that story. One came up in a book years ago called The Passover Plot, which suggested that he had been sedated on the cross, that he was removed quite early, and therefore could well have survived. That's certainly a possibility.
The disciples did manage to give Jesus some kind of substance on a sponge. They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon hyssop and put it to his mouth. And Jesus immediately died after taking this substance. When Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." But oddly enough, it isn't necessary to suggest that Jesus was sedated or drugged by whatever was on the sponge in order to believe that he could have survived. There are stories of people who did survive crucifixion. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote of one of his own friends surviving crucifixion in Palestine in the 1st century.
He's traveling out to a village named Tekoa to scout land for a Roman camp. And he notices that 3 of his friends are hanging on crosses. So he requests that they be allowed to, that they be brought down. And Titus, the Roman general, gives him permission. The 3 are brought down immediately and given medical care. And 2 of them died, but the third survived.
So is it possible that Jesus survived? Certainly his crucifixion was speedily executed, perhaps too speedily.
When you look at the story of Jesus and how he was executed by the Romans, he's on the cross for 6 hours. The assumption is that he's dead. The Roman soldiers checked the body. There were 2 others crucified according to the gospel accounts. And they broke the legs of those to hasten their death because the Sabbath day was coming. When they came to Jesus, they said he's already dead. Presumably, his body's motionless, he's quit breathing. They then prepare the body and put him in a tomb. And presumably it's sealed up and he's dead for all practical purposes. The question, though, is he clinically dead?
The question of clinical death is certainly raised by the fact that the herbs which Joseph of Arimathea took into the tomb with the body of Jesus were aloes. These are healing, not embalming herbs.
We do have stories, both from the modern world and from the ancient world, where people appear to be dead, and for all practical purposes they are dead. That is, they're not responding to the outside world, but then they do, in fact, revive or come back. We call it resuscitation, but if you want to press the language, that would be resurrection.
The idea that Jesus might have survived the crucifixion rather than risen from the dead seems provocative. But all the Gospels are quite clear that the disciples saw Jesus as if he were alive. If Jesus did survive, it does not necessarily mean that the resurrection story was a hoax or a deliberate falsehood.